Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. This time I'll be painting a Dark Angel Space Marine from start to finish using the official box art recipes. Dark Angels were my first real Warhammer army back during the 3rd edition of 40k, so I'm very excited to revisit this scheme for this tutorial, so let's get started. These are all the paints I'll be using for this tutorial. First of all here, I've already primed the model using a light dusting of Chaos Black primer. Over this, I've applied a base coat of Caliban green using an airbrush for speed. I'll be working in a few sub-assemblies for this project as I find it easier to reach everything, and I also find it much more manageable working in sections like this, but feel free to glue any parts together to the degree that you feel comfortable with. First of all, I like to quickly go around and black out the surrounding elements of the armour. It's important to do it at this stage, especially with the black undersuit, as mistakes can be more easily fixed. Once that's done, we need to shade the armour, and for this I'll use a 50-50 mix of Caliban green and black. I thin this down roughly 1 part paint to 2 parts water. Thinning it down like this will allow the paint to more easily flow into the recesses. This may take a few applications until we reach a nice opaque line shade. If you do happen to make any mistakes here, then it's easy just to go back in with Caliban green and tidy this up before moving on to the next stage. With the shading stage out of the way, it's time to highlight the armour, and for this I'll use a 50-50 mix of Caliban green and Warpstone glow. For this method of highlighting to work, we need to make sure that the previous stages are still visible later on. So for that reason, I recommend making this stage around 2 to 2.5 times the width of your sharpest highlight. This first stage is really quite subtle, so whilst I'm trying to remain as neat and uniform with it as I can, it doesn't matter too much if it's not as precise as the later stages. You might also notice with this and the following stage that the Warpstone glow has quite poor coverage, and it might take a few coats for it to show properly. I found it very tempting to thin the paint less to get a stronger coverage, however it's really important to thin it properly at this stage and be patient to avoid building up any visible texture. Different colours of paint will have different properties, and it's important to be aware of this. Some will require a bit more patience to cover properly, like a saturated green and yellow. However, this same property can make them great for glazing. Whenever I start on a new project and I use unfamiliar colours, I will test them out on something first, whether it be a spare part or in a less seen area of the model, to get a feel for how the paint behaves. For the second stage highlight, I'll be using pure Warpstone Glow, and I'm painting this within the previous stage, trying to be a bit more precise now. The Eavy Metal or box art style of painting is all about building a strong foundation for the following stages, so it really pays to take your time between stages to keep everything tidy. However, that being said, it's perfectly normal and human to make mistakes at any stage, and it's really important to know how to fix them. You can cut back into your highlights with the previous stage at any time that you need. I tend to find that if I make a mistake in the second or third stages, that cutting back in with the first chunky highlight stage will look fine. Here I decided to glaze some very thin down Warpstone Glow around some of the upper areas of the armor panels. This stage is completely optional, however as I mentioned earlier, Warpstone Glow has very poor coverage, so I'm using this to my advantage to smooth out the transitions of these first highlight stages. I could have gone much further with this and added some reflective highlights in places, but it's important not to go too far with this, otherwise the overall tone of the green will change and it'll start to look a bit too much like a salamander. For the next highlight stage, I'll be using Moot Green. It's important that we keep this stage as fine as possible and try to allow room for the previous stages to show to avoid a harsh transition. Again, if you do make any mistakes here, they can easily be corrected with the previous stage. Personally, I really like using the Winsor & Newton Series 7 miniature brush for this, as it has more of a triangular pointed tip and it's great for precision and detail work. If you can't get hold of this particular brush or they're a bit too costly, you could also try the Rosemary & Co Series 323 or the Artis Opus Series M. Like I say, this is just personal preference, so you can use a regular Kolinsky Sable brush and get the same result. I just find with these it's a little bit easier. This brush is a size 0, however I also use size 1s for this. Anything smaller I find the brush doesn't really last as long or hold enough paint. Now, brush control is obviously quite important for this stage, and that mostly just comes down to practice. However, there's several other factors that also contribute to it that I'd like to mention. So firstly, just being aware of the angle that you place the tip of the brush onto the figure. So if you can try to paint with the tip of the brush more vertically down onto the edge, and also try to move around the miniature so that the edge is more straight on. Pulling the brush towards yourself helps to create a much more natural and comfortable movement. And also being aware of the pressure that you're applying to the tip of the brush. For these fine edge highlights, you only need the slightest of pressure against the surface. Did you also know that where you place your fingers on the ferrule of the brush actually makes quite a large difference? Placing them closer to the tip of the brush will give you a much finer precision, but less range of movement. Bracing position is also very important, as I've explained in previous videos. Make sure that your painting hand and miniature holding hand is in a comfortable and braced position. For me, this is bracing against my desk with my hand holding the mini, and then bracing my painting hand against this hand. Both paint consistency and the amount of paint on your brush is also another key factor. I find that the further up in the highlight stages I go, I tend to thin the paint less. This helps to get a stronger and more opaque highlight without having to go back too many times. Quite often you might see that I have some paint on my left thumb, and I often paint onto my thumb before applying the brush to the model. This has a couple of important functions. Firstly, it allows me to adjust the amount of paint on the brush. Most of the time we just want the tip of the brush to have enough paint on it so that we have fine control and it doesn't splurge out all over the edge of the model. This can take some practice to learn, and it's not just important to know this for edge highlights, but also for any finer work on the miniature. Moving on now to the final highlight stage, I made a mix of Moot green and Ushabti bone. I applied this just as fine as the previous stage, but this time concentrating it towards the top edges of the armour. This stage is important as it helps to add the final sharpness to the armour and also slightly desaturates the acid green of the Moot stage. Finally, I added some dots of white to the most prominent corners of the armour. So here's a little bit of extra footage from the helmet now. The vents around the face in particular required a lot of brush control and also paint management, as I discussed earlier. I found that a magnifying headset helped me significantly with these areas. A cheap one can be purchased on Amazon for as little as £9, so it's definitely something I recommend trying. Here we have the finished helmet, and whilst we're working on this area, we might as well go ahead and paint in the lenses next. For this, I first base coat them using Mephiston Red. If you struggle painting in the lenses after the armour, you can always leave these highlights on the bottom of the eye until after the lens is complete. For the first highlight on the lens, I used Wild Rider Red. For the next stage, I used Fire Dragon Bright. This was followed by adding white into the Fire Dragon. I added a tiny bit of shading towards the top corner of the lens using corn red with a touch of black. Finally, I added some dots of white into the shaded corner of the eye. Next, it was time to paint the chest Aquilla, and for this I first base coat using Ushabti bone. This is then shaded with a thinned down Baneblade brown. I decided to go back here and tidy up the base coat, leaving the shading in the recesses. You can always leave this until after the final shade. I added a further shade of Steel Legion Drab. I use this much more controlled now to add some more definition around the feathers. For the first highlight stage, I used Screaming Skull. I use this to carefully pick out the edges of the feathers and skull. For the final highlight, I added white into the Screaming Skull. Now moving on to the metallics on the gun, I like to use Vallejo dark aluminium for this, as it's a nice slightly warm gunmetal. The only drawback is, as it's an airbrush paint, it's already pre-thinned and can be a little difficult to control, so I like to get this out of the way before tackling the casing. This paint is as close to foolproof as it gets in terms of getting a smooth base coat. As mentioned, it's already pre-thinned, so good to use straight from the pot. Just be aware that this paint will split quite quickly, particularly if used on a wet palette. If you don't have this paint, something like Citadel Lead Belcher or Iron Hand Steel will work fine. To shade this, I use my trusted mix of Liquitex Carbon Black with some Daler Rowney Matte Medium to take out a little bit of the shine from the ink. Make sure to thin inks down quite heavily with water. If you don't have Carbon Black, you could also use some Nuln Oil, Basilicanum Grey or Black Templar contrast paint, as they will do the same job. To avoid tide marks, I find it better to be a bit patient with this stage and apply more thinner coats to get a smooth finish, and I try to avoid the ink pooling anywhere that I don't want it to. For gunmetals, I find it much better to keep it nice and simple, so I find that adding one sharp highlight of Vallejo Model Air Silver around all of the edges is all that's required. To paint in the shell casings, I use Runelord Brass. This is then shaded with Gorgrunter Fur contrast paint, which I thin a little bit with water. A further deep shade is applied into the recesses using a mix of Doomball Brown and Black. This is then highlighted by adding Vallejo Model Air Silver into the Runelord Brass. Next it's time to paint the red part of the gun casing, which I base coated using Mephiston Red. I then shaded the red casing using a soft shade of corn red. This is glazed around all of the recesses, a bit wider than the line shade. For the deep shade, I used a mix of corn red and black. For the first chunky edge highlight on the red, I used Evil Sun's Scarlet and applied this around all of the edges of the gun casing, making sure to leave enough room for the subsequent highlights. For the second stage highlight, I used Squig Orange and I painted this within the previous stage around all of the edges of the casing. For the final and sharpest edge highlight on the red, I made a 50-50 mix of squig orange and white and applied this to the uppermost edges and corners. For these longer straight edge highlights, it's much easier to use the side of the tip of the brush to pick out the edge. Just make sure to have very little paint on the brush. Finally, I applied some dots of AK white on the most prominent corners of the gun casing. Here I'm just picking out the rivets of the gun casing using Vallejo Model Air Silver. Now for the black part of the gun casing, I'll be using my standard neutral grey-black recipe. Over a black base coat, I applied a chunky edge highlight of 50-50 black and Eshin grey. For the next stage highlight, I used a 50-50 mix of Eshin grey and Dawnstone. For the final stage, I applied a sharp edge highlight of Administratum Grey, again applying some white dots to the most prominent corners of the casing and picking out the rivets in silver. A lot of people were asking after the previous Space Marine video how I paint the undersuit or ribbing between the legs and arms, and it's basically the same recipe as the black gun casing, so I thought I'd show some footage of that here. I tend to work the highlights finer and lighter towards the outside of the leg where the light would naturally hit. If you do make any mistakes with the highlights, you can heavily thin down some black paint and apply it into the recesses of the undersuit. For the rope, I wanted a darker, richer and more purpley red, so I made a mix of Incubi Darkness and Cordon Red and applied this as a base coat. The rope was then shaded with a thinned down black paint. This should be similar to a wash consistency, and you can tidy any areas with the base coat afterwards if you need to. The rope is then highlighted by adding more and more Vallejo Ice Yellow into the base mix. You could also use Dawn Yellow or something like Ushabti Bone instead of the Ice Yellow. With the guns now finished, it was time to paint the leather. I didn't have the actual box art recipe for this, and usually I find that it can vary a little bit anyway, so I'll be using an approximate recipe for this and it should get us pretty close. For the base coat, I used Rhinox hide and applied this around the leather straps, belt and pouches. This is then shaded with a 50-50 mix of Rhinox hide and black, which is thinned down and glazed around the recesses. For the first chunky edge highlight, I used a 50-50 mix of Mournfang Brown and Rhinox hide and applied this around all of the edges of the leather. For the next highlight stage, I used pure Mournfang Brown and again painted this around all of the edges. For the next stage, I used a 50-50 mix of Mournfang Brown and Carrick Stone. Finally, for the sharpest and most prominent edges, I use pure Carrick Stone. You can go a little further with this and add some white to the Carrick Stone, just for the very corners for a super sharp leather. Now, with everything pretty much finished on the miniature, it was time to glue the parts together and get the basing done. I used Tamiya plastic cement to attach the feet to the base, and then superglued some rocks to the base for a little bit of added detail. I then applied some thinned down PVA glue and added some sand to the surface of the base. For this, I'll be using some Rival Crafts extra fine sand, but lots of different products will work. I'll be using the standard box art scheme for this base, exactly how I would have done in the studio. For the base coat, I use a thinned down Mournfang Brown. It's important to thin it with enough water so that it flows into the sand using capillary action. This way you don't have to risk touching near the feet with the brush, and it also doesn't fill any of the detail of the sand. After that was fully dry, I carefully dry brushed the base using Baylor Brown. This is followed with a dry brush of Ushabti Bone. The rocks are then picked out using Eshin Grey. I then give the rocks an overbrush with Dawnstone Grey, leaving the Eshin Grey in the recesses. This is then followed by a dry brush of Administratum Grey. The base rim is then picked out with a few thin coats of Steel Legion Drab. I then added a few Gamer's Grass Tiny Tufts to the base using PVA glue, and it was complete. This Dark Angel is from the 5th Company, and they would typically have a quartered knee marking, so I thought I would quickly show how I painted this. First of all, I marked out some small dots on the knee in a cross formation. You could then draw lines between these, however I found that this was enough to give me an idea of the placement, so I just started to block in the cream sections using Ushabti bone. I found that I did need to cut back into the cream slightly just to tighten up the design. The bottom left corner of the 5th company marking is black, so I made sure to pick this out using AK black. I then added a few scratches to the markings using Caliban green, and then picked out some highlights with Screaming Skull on the bone areas and then the previous black recipe on that quarter. And here we have the finished Dark Angel Sergeant. That's it for this video everyone, thank you for watching and thank you for the continued support here on Patreon. This video has been a long one and it took a lot to film and edit, so there might be some shorter videos coming up over the next month. The first part of Dante and True Metallics are on the way very soon. Catch you next time.